Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast, hosted by longtime Northwest sports journalist Dan Viens. News, reaction, and opinion. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viens.
Happy Blue Friday, Seahawks fans. We are less than 2 weeks away from the NFL draft now, and that brings us to one of my favorite times of the year, what has become an annual event. Having Chris Cluff on the show to preview the draft and talk about it from the Seahawks standpoint. Former Seattle Times beat writer, still loves to write about the Seahawks. If you're not following him on Twitter, let's fix that today. Also the author of 2 Seahawk-related books, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and Then Zorn Said to Largent. Chris, let's bring you in here. It's good to see you again. Welcome to our annual show.
Thanks for having me, Dan. It's always great to do this.
I want to jump right into this, first of all, because, you know, we've reached that point of the year and of the draft process where, you know, we've looked at all the prospects. We've seen the combine. We've watched tape until we're blue in the face. We've heard the rumors. And now I feel like these last couple of weeks, we get into a little bit of paralysis by analysis. And sometimes we overthink things because the process gets a little boring. And so we try to create excitement. And I try to do that by getting a little more creative in my mock drafts. And the reaction that I get from the fan base on some of these mocks makes me laugh sometimes. And it just makes me wonder how closely people really pay attention to what the Seahawks are doing. And that's what I intend to do today. And that's what I think is something that you're so good at, is looking at kind of what their historical trends are and reading between the lines of what they might do. And let me just start right at the top. As we sit here today, less than 2 weeks from the draft, the Seahawks own the number 5 pick. There's been lots of questions about to quarterback or not to quarterback. Is Jalen Carter, worthy of that pick with his off-field stuff? Where do you sit today? Your gut feeling on where they might go at 5?
My gut feeling is that they are probably going to have to make a decision between, picking Jalen Carter or probably moving down. That's my thought.
So you're off quarterback at this point.
Well, only because even if they really love Anthony Richardson that much, it seems like he might be gone in those top 4. I know there was, there's some rumors that the Colts might like Will Levis better and that maybe Richardson would slide because of that. But someone also might come up to 3 with Arizona, as we know. So, there's no guarantee that Richardson's there, but if he is, then maybe they love him enough. I know there's a segment of Seahawks fans who really would love Richardson to come to Seattle. And to me, here's how I look at number 5 pick. I look at it like a lottery ticket. Basically it's a bonus. The Seahawks have their native pick at 20. This is the bonus pick from the Wilson trade. Yeah. And if they want to gamble it, on Richardson, if they want to gamble it on Jalen Carter, there's an argument to be made that there would be nothing wrong with that. But then there's also the way to look at how John Schneider likes to do things. And he's talked a lot already about the value of that 5th pick in trading down, getting extra picks, also the cash and cap value if you move away from he's already talked about, like, before Carolina moved up to 1, he had talked to Scott Fitterer about going down to 9. And he had on his radio show, he had the numbers already. It was $2 million it was $8 million in cash and $2 million in cap just to move down from 5 to 9. So he's done his research on moving all around. And obviously we heard the tale about him possibly, considering moving up to 3. I think that's just him doing diligence as usual to figure out like what it takes to move around in the top 10, because they haven't done it too much, been up there. So those are the options. That's where I see it right now.
Well, and I guess the other option then would be, if you don't move down and you don't like either of those other choices, if you're not sold on Jalen Carter, then the option is to reach, right? And maybe take a guy that you don't value at 5 if you can't find a trade partner. I want to play a clip from his show yesterday that touches on this. He was specifically asked if his evaluation criteria has changed over the years. This is something that we've talked about a lot since 2017 and the Malik McDowell pick, after they traded down multiple times, not ignoring some red flags, but they were willing to take on the risk of some of those red flags and hoping they could unlock just the pure physical specimen that McDowell was, and how they've changed things since then. This is what John said about this, and then I want to chew on this a little bit with you afterwards.
There's every year you go back right away, like, and look at who went where and why and how you evaluated them, and do we grade them down because of medical issues? Was it off the field issues? Did we just miss the evaluation?
Mm-hmm.
Did we miss something with the character, the psychological aspect of it? There's just a ton that goes into it.
He mentions non-football aspects of the evaluation process 3 times in that short little soundbite. Do you think that, and they visited Tuesday night, I think it was, that Jalen Carter was in town. And I'm kind of surprised by this point. I mentioned this on the show the other day that we haven't seen any reports or, translation leaks from Drew Rosenhaus about how well that meeting went. I find that a little surprising. But do you feel like Jalen Carter might be that guy that's so talented that even if they're not 100% sold on his character, they might make the choice?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think they have to be sold on him to take him. I mean, Schneider has said, and it was after that 2017 kind of debacle with McDowell, that he talked about how they were trying to tighten up and basically kind of make better. They've always talked about smart, tough, and reliable, right? That's the core of their draft philosophy. So, but he didn't promise that they would never take a guy who was a risk before, ever again, so it's possible. And he said, on his show yesterday, he said, some teams won't necessarily take a player because they're afraid of blowback from the fan base, but we don't do that because we just believe in what we're doing and we just keep moving forward. That's a direct quote from that show as well. So in other words, he might, he might do it if they feel comfortable enough with Jalen Carter and don't feel like he's, like he said, he's checking out the person. He said, we're going to bring in the person, bring in his heart, bring in the mental aspect of it, the psychological part of it, the medical, a ton of stuff. So, and he said, about his overall strategy, you have to be pliable and you have to be able to take all this information, but come back to what your core values are. So what are their core values? That's smart, tough, reliable that Schneider's been saying for years. And the question really becomes do they think Carter is smart enough, tough enough, reliable enough for them? That's what it comes down to.
Yeah. Interesting. He also talked about fit and how they build their board and draft by their board, not by any consensus or not by, as you said, like what they think other people would think or even what other teams would think. And I found this interesting because I'm about to play a soundbite that's part of a longer kind of drawn out answer where he sort of backs off. At the very beginning of this offseason, he talked about how their draft process evolved again last year and that they leaned more heavily into best player available as opposed to trying to force or push a fit. He backed off that a little bit in his show yesterday where he talked about how fit is important. And this is a little bit of what he had to say about that.
It depends on the class, best fit, best player, best fit, and away we go. And that's the fit part is something that, and again, I know this is entertainment. So when you guys are talking about, I think, these mock guys have this here and that there and all that, and it's understandable because of the player. The easiest thing to do is evaluate the player. Right. That's the easiest part. Bring in the person, bring in the, his heart, bring in the mental aspect of it, the psychological part of it, the medical. There's a ton of stuff that goes into it.
The question that Wyman asked leading into the longer answer that I took that out of was specific to the cornerback position. And there was a report yesterday from ESPN's Brady Henderson that the Seahawks really, really like Devin Witherspoon, the really physical, tenacious corner out of Illinois. Corbin Smith told me personally, same thing, and talked about it with me on the show last week, that he's been told by his sources with the organization that they're extremely high on Witherspoon. But man, I'm telling you, I did a mock yesterday just playing around with that scenario. And even if I trade down and take a corner, the blowback that I get from fans, because the Seahawks have never taken a corner higher than 90 under Schneider and Carroll, so they never will. I'm about to show a graphic, but I want you to speak about that a little bit because I feel like, based on Schneider's comments, that they just haven't taken a corner that high because it just hasn't fallen that way.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, it's like you said yesterday, every draft's different and every draft lines up for each team a little differently. No team drafts purely for best player available. I mean, imagine this. You go through the entire draft, you end up with 7 cornerbacks. And the owner says, why'd you take 7 cornerbacks? And the GM says, well, boss, that was the best player at every time it came for us to pick. So that's what we ended up with. Nobody does that, So, of course, every team drafts for need. There are times when there is a player that just jumps out. You're like, well, we got to have that guy, or that your roster is so strong. Say, take us back to 2013 draft. The Seahawks took Christine Michael in the second round. I mean, and they didn't need a running back. They had Marshawn Lynch. They were in pretty good shape there, but they kind of decided to go high on a high ceiling guy. They felt they could maybe replace Lynch later and back him up for the interim. So there are times they've definitely done best player available, but for the most part, like you said, John Schneider always says we draft for our roster. So basically that means they draft for the needs of their team, which is pretty much what everybody does anyway. So,
and you want to draft, you want to draft to the strength of the draft class, and you want to get the best bang for your buck at every pick, right? And
that's true.
And that's when he talks about, the reach is the traditional term, but I like he uses the term push, and that you don't want to push something because most of the fan base, I'm sure you've heard this and seen it on Twitter too, man, they want to lay out the entire usage of the 10 picks based on need. I hear this every single day. I want defensive linemen in the first 2 rounds, and then I want my center, and then I want to address it. Teams don't do that. And I'm going to bring this graphic in now. And this is something you put together that shows the strong position groups in this draft relative to how many of them are graded as first round picks, right?
Yep.
So on the left-hand side here, you go from 0 to 6. That's number of players with first round grades. Is that right?
Yep.
That we're looking at here. And then as you go from left to right, you're talking about in the top 150.
Total numbers in the top 150 for each position. Exactly right.
And so upper right quadrant is strong position group in the first round. And then the color coding is what you've determined the Seahawks' biggest needs are, with that bright green, the action green being their biggest needs. And so when you look down in the left-hand corner, a lot of fans want us to take linebackers. Well, it's just not a strong class, especially at the top end of the draft. And there's another discussion to be had about whether teams even value linebackers that high anyway. You look up in this upper right quadrant, and there's edge and defensive line, which is where most fans want us to focus. But at the top of the list is corner. It's the strongest position group in the first round. There's some dynamic talents. There's talents that fit the Seahawks thresholds and all the specs and everything they look for. If they don't like Carter at 5 and they don't have a quarterback that they like, isn't that the next logical place for them to look? Because there isn't another edge rated that high except maybe Tyree Wilson.
Yeah. So, think about this one. Maybe if they don't, if Richardson's not there, or they're not interested in Richardson, or they use him as a trade chip, or Jalen Carter's not, somebody they're interested in, maybe they move down from 5 a bit, and they're able to get somebody like, maybe Tyree Wilson is there, or maybe Witherspoon is the guy they want. Like, say they trade down to 9, and they really like Witherspoon, and they want to grab him there. Maybe then they also come up from 20. So, I've kind of ran through this thing where maybe they end up with 2 of these guys, Richardson, Wilson, Witherspoon, or Pete Skoronski, the Northwestern left tackle, who would probably become a guard and a really good one. And and he also has experience at center. So he could be a guy that they either in a trade down or trade maybe a little up from 20, they end up with as that interior O-line guy, where we see that's a need for them, but it's also not a really deep class for that, and not a very elite class for that. So he could be one of those answers. Yeah,
I've had that discussion with people too. And it's interesting. It's after we get past 5 right? Once we get to 20 and beyond, and 20 is the biggest mystery to me, because we've heard over and over again that the lack of blue chip talent at the top of this draft, that some teams might only have 10 to 15 first round grades. And so the drop off there, basically at 20, you're drafting a guy that you like, that you don't think is going to last until 37. And I've had so many debates with people and some borderline arguments about how I've used the 20th pick. And usually the argument goes like this: I would have waited to take that guy later. I would have taken one of the other guys you took at 20. Who cares if at the end of the day you look at the list of players and it's a list of players you think is going to help the team, right? But I want to go back to one of your points too about need versus best player available, because John liked to talk at the beginning of the offseason about how last year they leaned more heavily on best player available. And yet they end up addressing their two biggest needs, which was bookend tackles and cornerback. So he is going to draft for need, right?
Yeah. And, last year, like this year, they're drafting pretty high. They had things kind of fell in a good way for them, and that's what's going to happen this year too, because whether they pick at 5 or just a little below 5, still in the top 10, they're going to get a really good player who's going to help them in some way. And then with the 20th pick, you're right. That's absolutely a no man's land down there. And that's where they're often drafting anyway, is in the 20s. And that's why we see some weird picks from them. We're getting so-called weird from, our perspective, because from the mid 20s or even 20 all the way down into like the mid 40s, like you said, it's all pretty much the same caliber of player. So that's why they've traded down so often, is because they're like, why should we pay so much to a guy that we know we can get in the second round, or we grade as a second round guy? We grade them all basically as second round guys at this point. And so that's what you were going to see with this 20 is that's why I think they're going to move from 20. Whatever they do at 5, they're going to move from 20. It's either going to be up or down, depending if there's a guy they'd really like. Say Witherspoon slides a little bit and they can get from 20 to 13 and you still get him, maybe that's a move that they make, or Skoronski, one of those guys, and they feel like, hey, this is a really good guy who immediately comes in and starts for us. Let's make the move. We'll throw a second round pick to whichever team it is we're trading with and get him. So I could see them totally moving up from 20, whether they stay or move off of 5.
Interesting. Especially with that ledge kind of presumably being around 15, it seems most people agree. One other general question before we get into some specific players. Schneider has talked, and he did, and you've referenced it already in the show. He has talked more about cash and cap this year than I've ever heard him talk. And part of that might just be that he's made himself more available this year. Having that weekly radio show through the draft process has really been enlightening. What does that mean? And is that something that the casual fan should worry about?
No, I don't think it's anything to worry about. The Seahawks, when it comes to the cap, they have their way of doing things. We know that they don't like to, he talked about it again. He doesn't like to extend things too far out into the future. That's why we always see 2 and 3 year deals, and that's pretty much it, except for the big stars who will maybe get a 4-year deal. And he doesn't like to, that they did void years a couple years ago. That's something they almost never do. They don't like to restructure. He talked about that already this offseason on his radio show about how, he was asked, well, what about restructuring some of your guys? That kicks money down into the future, which he doesn't like to do. So, they're very like, they pay attention to cash and cap, and they try to keep their cap close to their cash. So what they're spending in that year, they want their cap to equal that as much as they possibly can. And I feel like, him talking more about a cash budget this year might have something to do with the estate of Paul Allen. And
that was my,
how much money Jody Allen really has to budget for the Seahawks. So I think there might be something like that in the background at play that, most fans aren't really aware of.
Real quick, since you brought it up, where do you think that stands? Because this week there's a tentative or a non-exclusive agreement for a buyer for the Commanders. We know Jeff Bezos, the Amazon executive from Seattle, was involved in that process. And there were reports yesterday that one of the reasons he backed away and didn't push harder for that is he's waiting for the opportunity to buy the Seahawks. What do you think the timeline is on that currently?
It's hard to say. I mean, I've seen where reports where Jody Allen is not in any hurry to offload the Seahawks, that she enjoys, being the owner of the team at this point. She has a lot of other things to deal with Paul's estate. And so the Seahawks are not really a priority as far as that stuff goes. And so I could see it being like another 5 years before we really see anything happen. Because nothing seems super imminent there. And I know there's scuttlebutt that Jeff Bezos is just kind of biding his time, and that, he would like to, get in on the Seahawks since he wasn't able to get in on Washington. So, I feel like, we'll know more over the next 5 years. And it might, and at some point it might be hastened. It might be like, oh, in 2 years from now, all of a sudden, all of a sudden now Jody Allen has the team on the market. I think it might be kind of sudden. Like, people will be surprised by it, but they shouldn't be. Because within the next 5 years, this will become a bigger topic, I think.
Do you think in some way it may be connected to whenever Pete Carroll decides to call it quits? She seems to really enjoy that relationship and working with him.
Yeah, they seem to all get along. I mean, Schneider's references her a lot. They sit together at games a lot and watch the games together. So she's definitely really involved with those two. And obviously, she chose those two over Russell Wilson. That was super clear. And so we'll just see. I'm not sure that the franchise's fate is tied to Pete Carroll's future. I'm not sure that's definite, but I think that she does enjoy the situation as it is now, and that's why there's not a real rush, considering she has other things with the estate to deal with, that she can still keep the Seahawks for a while. And yeah, maybe in the end it does kind of time with Pete. And but maybe not. So it's hard to say that.
Yeah. All right, let's get into the draft. As you look at this thing, and I'm not talking about 20 or 37, anywhere in the draft, who are some of the guys that you've looked at that you absolutely love and think would be great fits and would love to see the Seahawks walk away from the draft with?
Well, you and I on Twitter have talked about Jack Campbell, the linebacker. Yeah. I'm calling this a big boy draft. In my mind, that's what it needs to be. It needs to be the lines, the O-line. They need interior help. The D-line, they need all kinds of help, and they need linebacker help. So, front seven basically, because all their linebackers that they have are on 1-year deals. They're all gone. Jordan Brooks is in the last year of his contract. They're probably not. I can't see them picking up his option because he's coming off of the knee injury. So. And then you have Bobby Wagner and Bush, and those guys just signed 1-year deals. So you have no linebackers next year, none. So Jack Campbell, to me, he tested off the charts at the combine, which surprised a lot of people. He's a very, very effective linebacker and a big guy, 240 plus pounds. I think he's 6'4". So, I mean, there's some really, there's not a deep linebacker class, but on day 2, there are going to be some good options. And I really think the Seahawks are going to use one of their day 2 picks on one of those linebackers. I mean, it would make a lot of sense considering their need and the talent that they're going to run into at that point on day 2. So he's one guy anyway who jumps out. Yeah.
I've talked a lot about Campbell, as you said, and because he's really the only one in the draft that's built like he is. He's really the only guy in the draft that's really built to be a Mike linebacker, middle linebacker, a guy that would succeed Bobby at kind of his traditional position. The problem is, and obviously real life doesn't always reflect simulated life, but man, I have a hard time getting him in mocks. He's either snapped up between 20 and 37, or if at 37 I decide to take another defensive lineman or a center or something like that, he doesn't last until the end of the second round because of the dearth at the position. And here you show, or on your chart there, it was pretty evident that he seems like a guy that might get overdrafted.
Yeah, and I think when you see those positions that aren't very deep, that tends to happen too. That it's like quarterback. Quarterback is a prime example. Like Anthony Richardson and Will Levis are two guys who should not be top 10 picks, on the norm, but they very well may be, because quarterback is a coveted position. And when you have somebody that you think could be turn into what you want them to be, but I mean, it's also a huge bust percentage on quarterbacks too. So, but they're pushed as you use John Schneider's term, push, right? They're pushed up. And so you'll see that, I think, at some of these other positions as well. Yeah.
How do you like our guy from Wazoo, Dan Henley?
I think he'd be great. I think he'd be a nice pick. They really need those either active or big guys in the middle. And, Campbell's real big and more athletic than people thought, based on what his combine numbers showed. So, he's a real good thumper to put it in the inside there. But I think Henley would be good too. He's got great range. He's got good speed, and he's a tackling machine too. I mean, all these guys, coaching will make them better than what they were. Whatever their flaws were. Campbell's called out for not making every tackle. Like he misses some tackles here and there. Well, hopefully the Seahawks clean up all their tackling problems from what they had last year.
Yeah.
So let's see that happen. But Henley would be another good option, I think.
And then I find this interesting too, that that of their top 30 visits so far, and there's, I think 21 have been reported so far. So and Schneider talked about on the show yesterday, they're getting close to being done with all of those. Although keep in mind, and I've even been guilty of doing this. Once the names start coming out, I tend to cater some of my mock drafts to guys they've visited with. And I need to even remind myself, and if some fans might not be aware, that these are just the 30 guys that they can have out here in person. And Schneider talked on his show yesterday about how that doesn't necessarily mean it's their 30 favorite guys. Some of them are guys they just didn't have a chance to catch up with at the combine, or that they want to take another look at. And some of those visits are used to get an early recruiting pitch in for players that they think might slip out of the draft and be undrafted free agents. Of their early reported visits, almost all of them were safeties early on. I think they had 5 safeties in for their visits. They signed Julian Love. They let Ryan Neal go, but they stepped up and paid Julian Love, I think, more than people expected them to pay another safety. You and I have talked every single year about the situation at safety with Diggs, Adams. Did it catch you by surprise, just the way the roster's put together right now when they signed Julian Love?
Mildly, because they also had Ryan Neal. And but obviously, I mean, Love is he's a team captain. He's like a great player for the Giants. And somehow they got him. I mean, John Schneider kept talking about all the guys they got them for less, most of them for less. They thought he thought their markets would be higher, including Love, So getting him for a couple years at what was it, $12 million total? So about $6 million a year. That's great. I mean, it's too bad that they had to let Ryan Neal go because he is a talented player, and they're in a bit of a crunch. If they had the cap space, they probably would have kept him, and they would have had some extra padding at that position, because you just don't know if Jamal Adams is ever going to be able to be healthy, unfortunately. And most fans are just didn't like the trade to begin with, hated that they paid him. But I mean, once they made the trade, you knew they were going to pay him, and you knew they were going to give him every chance. And they still are going to give him a chance this year to come back from his injury, to fit into their new defense, and to fit in with the 2 safeties so they can play all 3 safeties. That's what Pete has said they want to do. And he wants to play them a lot, he said. So I think Love is a great addition, and will be going forward, because you don't know next year what, Adams probably more than a 50% chance he won't be back next year, no matter what happens this year, because his cap number is so ridiculously high, and he would have to play out of his mind for them to even consider bringing him back, I think. And then
stay healthy.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a given, right? Exactly. So then Diggs only has 1 year left, so you would have Diggs and Love next year again, and so you have your starting safeties set for the next 2 years. So that's okay. But yeah, it's always good to look ahead. And they have a lot of day 3 picks. They have picks across the board. So they definitely will look at defensive back. I mean, all these corners they're bringing in too, people are pointing that out. And yeah, it's because the draft is deep at that position. So yeah, bring in corners, and the ones that you're interested in, the ones that you have questions on. That's usually what these top 30s are, right? Either they weren't at the combine, they weren't invited, so that hey, we need to bring them in. Or there's a medical situation that they want to check out about some of these guys, or Jalen Carter, prime example, character situation. We'll want to talk to him face to face. What does he have to say for himself? So, yeah, a lot of corners.
And then I find it interesting that throughout this entire process, when you hear reports of who they met with at the combine, who they met with at the Senior Bowl, and then you look at this list of top 30 visits, 1 wide receiver. Very few reports of them meeting with any skill position players, not a single tight end or running back on a top 30 visit. Do you think that's smoke screen to some extent? Because you can make an argument that those skill position are significant needs.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely need help, backup help at running back. To me, those are really day 3 things. We saw on the chart, wide receivers, it's not an elite class, this year, and you'll find different teams will rank the receivers totally differently, based on their needs or what they like in receivers or whatever. And, I know there are tons of Seahawks fans who are like, we need a wide receiver. I'm not as big on that. I mean, yes, they need a third receiver. They do. But there are many ways to get that. And that might even happen after the draft. Still a lot of veterans out there. Yeah. They could get one on a minimum deal because that's what guys will be signing for the most part after the draft. But I mean, day 3 of the draft, just not the 4th round. Let's not draft a wide receiver in the 4th round. Always fail, right? Like there's like 0 for 5 or something on that. But
I should show that list.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Chris Durham, who was a kid from Alabama they ended up trading. Anyway, so yeah, a lot of guys that have not done well in the 4th round at receiver. Yeah. So let's just skip to the 5th round if we're going to start be drafting receivers. But they also have a couple young guys that they like from last year's draft. So
well, and Schneider went out of his way on his show yesterday to talk about how some of their best receivers they've had in their regime have been undrafted guys, and
totally.
And Doug Baldwin and Jermaine Kearse. And
I always say this: the Seahawks have been to the Super Bowl 3 times. Does anybody really remember who their wide receivers were? I mean, other than Doug Baldwin, who's kind of a mythic figure in Seattle now. Yeah. But I mean, like you just said, undrafted. Go back to the first Super Bowl in 2005. Who remembers who their receivers were? It was Darrell Jackson, Bobby Ingram, but those guys weren't.
I remember Jackson because of the penalty in the end zone, but that's
totally. Yeah,
that's the only reason why.
The flaky penalty, yeah. But so now they have 2 stars, right? It's the best duo they've ever had at wide receiver, and these guys are really good. So they play through injuries. They gut it out all the time, and they have star games, like they take turns having superstar games. So yeah, they need some backup help, but they also have tight ends. They have Noah Fant. Tight ends another position we maybe talk about here in the draft. It's a deep one relative to tight ends. So maybe they're looking at a tight end on day 2 as well, or day 3. I mean, it extends out, fairly deep. So,
well, you mentioned what's to come. Let's talk about that. And you make a great point about receiver, because I think Marquise Goodwin was added just late in the process last year, right? Like shortly before training camp, if I recall. And there's still, man, when you pull up, if you want to have some fun, go on whatever site you choose, just Google remaining NFL free agents, and that list is long, and there's some cool names on there at running back, receiver, still some defensive line guys out there. And that leads me to my to this question. Obviously the Seahawks would have to and will have to maneuver some salary things in order to be cap compliant after the draft. Right now, as it stands today, they wouldn't be able to sign all of their draft picks at their current positions based on slotted dollar amounts. So they've got some things in store, either extensions they're confident in, or I know you said Schneider doesn't like to, but this year they might have to and restructure some bonus and salary. There are a bunch of veterans sitting out there. There are guys the Seahawks have released this offseason that are sitting out there. Poona Ford has taken a visit, but he hasn't really garnered a lot of interest. There are reports that Al Woods has an offer from Cleveland, but he's telling them to wait. Do you see the possibility that some of those guys may end up still coming back into the fold based on how the draft goes?
Oh, totally. I wouldn't dismiss that. Everyone at this point, it seems like, is most of the NFL, other than OBJ signing the other day, the most of the NFL is just sitting tight. They're getting ready for the draft. It's 2 weeks away, but all their thoughts and focus are on that. And that certainly applies to the Seahawks. And after that, everybody reevaluate where they sit, where their holes are, and those veterans who are sitting out there will start to find their teams. That'll definitely happen. So will the Seahawks maybe bring back Poona Ford or Al Woods? It's possible. It's totally possible because the nose tackle is not very deep in this draft, and it'll have to fall just right for them to get a guy that, they need somebody to start at that position. That's the one starting hole that they have in their defense.
There literally isn't one on the roster. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't tell me Jaron Reed's going to play nose. I know John Schneider said, he can play nose. In a pinch, in a serious pinch, So, nose tackle, they know they have a problem there. They mentioned it. They've admitted it. And both Pete and John. So they got to fix that. They got to figure it out. Hopefully they find a good guy in the draft by maybe day 2 that they can get. Because after that, there's not really, they're looking at project guys that may or may not, and they're not really starter types. So if you end up with a day 3 nose tackle, you definitely have to go back to Puna and, Al or whoever you can find out there, and get somebody.
Let's end with this. How close do you think this roster is to really being a true contender in the NFC? And specifically, if they nail this process the next couple of weeks, and have a draft similar to last year's in terms of rookies that can contribute and make an impact, how close do you think this team is to really being a contender?
Well, I think their offense is in pretty good shape. They, they've filled every position as they like to do, but they definitely need to upgrade their interior offensive line still. And so that part needs to be taken care of. They need to address tight end for the future because all their tight ends are done after this year, basically. So then it comes down to defense. And really, they're still trying to figure out how to run their defense. And they really, the kind of bodies, the kind of players that they want to fill that front seven. And so, and they're still kind of plugging those holes right now. And it's incomplete. The front seven is totally incomplete. And so this draft will go a long way toward telling us, did they take a positive step, in this front seven? I think they will. They're definitely going to get at least a couple guys who will start or push to start. But is it going to be good? I mean, I don't know. It wasn't last year. So I can't say that their defense is ready to contend at this point. Let's see what the draft brings, and let's see what they have put together by training camp. And then we can maybe look at, whether that we think they've improved or not. The secondary to me is in pretty good hands at the moment. Yeah. They've got good players all across the board there. And I know people are really clamoring for cornerback because they don't think that Jackson or Brown is good enough, but Jackson and Brown will have an incredible battle in camp if there's nobody else there. And the best man will win, and they'll have 2 good corners and 2 good safeties, so their secondary is in good spot. But yeah, front seven, to me, this draft is all about the front seven to me.
Indeed. Can't wait for it to get here. Just a reminder that the first round of the draft, I will be live streaming the entire thing. So if you want to get in on that, mark your calendars, and we're going to have a lot of fun with that. Have some guests in as well. Thanks again, Chris. Always good having you on the show. Remember to hit like on YouTube and subscribe to the page so you know when there's live streams, and you can comment and get notifications of new episodes. Chris, enjoy the process, man. Thanks for being on.
Yeah, you too, Dan. It'll be a fun one. It's going to be really interesting. Thanks for having me.
Follow him on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter. I will be back Monday with another mock draft Monday. Next week, also meeting with Emery Hunt of CBS Sports, and Dana O'Gorman, my former co-host on Field Goals, will be joining me to catch up and give her thoughts on the draft as well. Until then, I am Dan Vians. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.